Hello, and welcome to the Building a Mindful New Year program, brought to you by the Open Heart Project. I'm David, and I'm happy to be your host for this first day of 6 days discussing the 6 paramitas. According to Buddhist thought, there are only 6 skills that you need to cultivate in order to bring more joy, peace, and bravery into the world. And they are known as the 6 paramitas, or transcendent actions, or the 6 perfections. They have many names, but they sound deceptively simple in order for their great benefits. And they are generosity, discipline, patience, exertion, meditation, and wisdom. And for each of the next 6 days, a different accomplished Buddhist teacher from a variety of lineages will be offering a talk and a meditation based on the 6 paramitas. So I'm very happy to announce that tonight's speaker will be Pema Khandro Rinpoche, who is an accomplished Tibetan Buddhist teacher, humanitarian, and scholar specializing in the Tibetan Buddhist yogi and Dzogchen traditions. So just a quick note on the format. We will have a talk and meditation toward the beginning. And as we continue towards the end, we will have a time for questions and answers. So at any point, if you have questions or answers, please go ahead and type them into the chat window. Simply press the chat bubble, whatever that looks like on your device, and it will open a window where you can enter questions or comments. And we will revisit those towards the end of the presentation. And as we get to the end, we may also have the opportunity, if you would like to come live on the air with us, to offer your question actually as on video or on audio if you don't want to turn on your camera. So without further delay, I'm happy to welcome our teacher, Pema Khandro Rinpoche.
Benza Guru Pema City. Good evening, everyone. I am really honored to be a part of this series and to be invited to teach alongside these teachers, and also to meet you in your home, in your car, and on your phone, or wherever you are. It's such a beautiful, wonderful idea that really was born from Susan, that Dharma could be there every day and accessible. And of course, this is just one part of a whole year-long series of these online classes that are given on a regular basis. And so I fully celebrate that, and I feel honored to be with you tonight. The teaching for tonight is on the 6 paramitas, or the 6 perfections. This is actually the path to living an awakened life. We can think of spiritual awakening in just like an inexhaustible number of perspectives. What is the mindset we need? What are the actions we need? How does this change our relationship? What does it mean about our body, our emotions, our mind? But actually, in the path of the awakened mind warrior, the bodhisattva, it is said to all boil down to 6 trainings, that if we train in these qualities, then we will thoroughly train in such a way that we can actually transform our lives and live at the level of a Buddha, which is really quite an extraordinary assertion, I think. So I would like to start by telling the story of Yeshe Tsogyal, who is the female Buddha of Tibet, because when I think of the six paramitas, I always think of her. The six perfections to me are episodes in her life story. And in particular, I will focus on generosity, since that is the one of the six that I will be teaching you tonight. In Tibetan Buddhism, they believe that there was a female Buddha called Yeshe Tsogyal, and her name means ocean of wisdom, ocean of primordial wisdom, or the queen. This is the gyal of the Tsogyal, like the queen of the ocean of wisdom. And her life is a life of extraordinary journey, from privilege to extreme hardships and austerities and even being abused, to treading the spiritual path with vigor and intensity, and to awakening into a path of enlightenment. And when her life story is told, we often hear of the hardships that she underwent. And this is really part of how Tibetan Buddhist stories work. They are presentations of Buddhist philosophy and meditation practice and parts of history and parts of culture. And in her life, this all is expressed through this story of extreme hardships. Do we take these stories as literal? Do we take them as symbolic? Well, there are Buddhists who take both of those views. And so I just leave it to you to draw from it whatever you will, because that's the point of Buddhist stories. They really demand interpretation. They compel us to make sense of them somehow. And we each, in that process of wrestling with them, have an encounter with our own mind and our own values. So Yeshe Tsogyal's story in terms of generosity comes about through three major episodes in her life. The first is when she goes out to train on her own and go and retreat for the first time. She had been training with her teacher and received all the instructions, accomplished all the practices. And at some point, her teacher told her, you need to go and do retreat and experience intensive solitary practice. And so as she set out to go and do this retreat, she ended up finding a place near a glacier and doing these really intense practices. They say that the practice was so austere and in such terrible conditions that she almost died several times. But every time her life was threatened, she just kept raising her enlightened intent higher and higher and higher. And her enlightened intent, her bodhicitta is what it's called, it became so strong that it would carry her through and somehow she would survive. And at the end of this time, she was traveling through a valley in Nepal, or mountains and valleys in Nepal. And while she was traveling alone in these places that are far from the city, far from villages, far from homes, she became aware that she was being stalked. Actually, there were 7 thieves, and these were famous thieves of these lands. And they had seen that she was traveling alone and that she was helpless. So she saw that they were following her and realized that there was nothing for her to do. She couldn't outrun them. There was no place she could run to. And obviously she couldn't fight them. And so she instead decided to do her spiritual practice. She sat down and recited her mantras, and she made all of the gold that she had into a mandala offering. And in this way, she piled up the gold and said these mantras. And as she was doing this, the thieves were really confused at what was going on because they were there to mug her. But she was starting to recite these mantras. And then in this course of this recitation of these prayers, she gave them her gold. And she said, "May you find freedom through generosity." And later, these thieves became her students. They were so transformed by the experience that they end up being her first students. Another interesting time in the life of Yeshe Tsogyal, where she was giving a teaching about generosity, was when she was talking with Sakyadema, who was one of the people who also trained with her teacher. And as she was talking to her, the woman asked Yeshe Tsogyal, "Please give me whatever esoteric teachings that you have received, and I will give you the teachings that I have received. And together we can compare what we've received and fill in the blanks and so forth." So Yeshe Tsogyal prepared a teaching and gave it to her. And the first thing that she said was, "My mind is a spontaneous source of every desire. It is the source of inexhaustible wealth. And this is the true practice of generosity." And so then she went on and gave another teaching. And then finally, the third episode that I'll comment on tonight is a time later in Yeshe Tsogyal's life, when this female Buddha of Tibet had already done her austerities, and her realization was growing and growing and growing. And she entered into the final stretch of her training, which was to exchange one's own karma with others. And so during that time, they say that she gave food to the hungry. She gave clothes to those who were destitute. She gave refuge to those who were forlorn, and practiced all manner of generosity. So much so that her fame spread as a great yogini who was working to relieve the suffering of others. And one person who heard about this was a leper. And his leprosy was quite advanced. His nose had rotted out, so there is only a hole. And also he had a lot of pus coming out from sores in his body. And they say that his body had this foul odor just always. And he came to her and was crying. And so Yeshe Tsogyal, the female Buddha, asked, "Well, why are you crying?" And the leper said, "Well, I'm crying because my wife has left me." And Yeshe Tsogyal was surprised. She thought he would be crying because of his diseased body. But he said, "No, actually, I was cursed, and I have this plague of my body. And when my wife saw it, she kicked me out of my house. And she was like a daughter of the gods, like you. She was so beautiful and so pleasant. And now I'm so lonely. So will you be my companion?" And Yeshe Tsogyal said, "Yes, I will," and was his companion until he died. And so these are three times that generosity was exemplified in the life of Yeshe Tsogyal. Of course, there were a few more, but I shortened it for tonight. And I think that they give us a very radical view of generosity that puts us in the space of having to make sense of what generosity is and how we should practice it, and how much is too much. When is generosity gone too far, if ever? Generally, when in Tibetan Buddhism, when we teach about generosity, the perfection of generosity, it's thought that there's 3 types of giving. There is the material giving, and this is, for example, feeding animals and giving the clothing, or it could be giving gifts to others. And this can be done on the most ordinary level or the most exceptional level. They say in the words of my perfect teacher, the Kunzang Lame Shelung, that the exceptional giving is when you give something that's really precious to you to someone else. Then this is the practice of this kind of material generosity. It can also be, of course, medicine for the sick or giving money to the poor and so forth. And this kind of material generosity is what we train to be able to practice as practitioners as the beginning when we train in generosity. We want to give in this way. And indeed, in Yeshe Tsogyal's story, she gave like this, and like this. And the reason, of course, for Buddhists is because this is a action that points us to our true nature, which is compassionate and abundant and interdependent with others. That if we're giving our material gifts, then we are actually acting the way that it is most innate for us to act, as if we are deeply interconnected with others and their happiness is as important as ours. But there is another kind of material giving that's also taught, which is that we reduce our desires. This is probably much harder for us than just giving things, material things, to reduce our desires and be content with what we have. But it's really quite an important practice, and you see it as a really a backbone of a Buddhist lifestyle, to be content with what we have. And this is sometimes harder, sometimes easier. But one of the things that I learned from my teacher was that when I feel poor, to clean and take care of everything I already have, to polish it like a jewel. And I've actually found this to be true. Then I suddenly feel wealthy again. If we reduce our desires, this is an act of generosity because it makes resources available for others. But this is different than the generosity that we have heard about when we listen to the story of Yeshe Tsogyal and the thieves. This wasn't material generosity. This was the generosity of gladly accepting hardships. And when the 3 types of generosity are taught, the first one, material giving, this notion of gladly accepting hardships is actually part of the category of material giving, which is really interesting. It's called the exceptional generosity or the exceptional giving, to gladly accept hardships. In this case, she was being assailed by the thieves and she gave them her gold. I don't know what pops up for you when you hear that story, but I hear words like, oh, enabling, enabling abuse, right? We have these ideas in our mind, of course, and we should be very wary and wonder, where is the line? But there is something very true and wholesome about this story, something actually I was remembering today in my own life situation. That there are times when we will lose, when we will fail, when we will not get what we want. And in those times, to accept the situation gladly and give what's needed is also a practice of generosity. In this case, they were going to take her gold. There was nothing she could do, and she could have built up all kinds of tension and resentment, but instead she sang beautiful mantras and told them, May you find freedom through generosity, and gave it to them. And it's really sometimes that we need to be like this. Accepting our hardships is a practice of generosity, and we can do it beautifully and graciously and give what's needed. The second type of generosity that's taught, there's material generosity, and then the second is giving protection from fear. This is the way that we practice generosity to train in this perfection of generosity, is to give others protection from fear. And how can we do this? We actually have many ways to do it. And one that's brought up by Patrul Rinpoche in the classic text I mentioned before, the Kunzin Lama Shalom, which we train in these 6 perfections from. He says, well, this means that we put food in the mouths of hungry animals and hungry people. This is also protection from fear. And so, of course, this falls into material generosity, but it's also a way to alleviate the fear that others have. But this is more than just that practical giving. It also is a matter of doing whatever we can to help others in difficulty. Sometimes we don't know how to do that. Actually, empathy is a skill that we can train in. We can learn this if we don't know. We can show up to the funeral. We can call when we've heard that one of our friends or acquaintances has had something difficult happen to them. Whatever we can to help others in difficulty. This is giving them protection from fear, because it protects them from the fear of being alone, of being helpless. We can also save the lives of animals and fish and flies and ants and spiders. From the Buddhist point of view, even the small creatures, if we save their lives, it's just like saving a human being's life, that no size changes the amount of merit and altruism that comes from such a positive act. We can save the life of an ant that's in our kitchen, just as we would save the life of someone that we love. And in the same way, it accumulates that much positive karma from the Buddhist point of view. Also, giving freedom from fear is to give protection to those who have no protection. And this, of course, reminds me so much of our responsibility that we have to speak up and support those who don't have a voice, who don't have privilege, who don't have power. It's actually our duty to help those who are needing protection, to be an ally. Sometimes this can mean that we are just listening when we hear their troubles, and we can say, I believe you. We can listen, and when we hear their troubles, we can feel what that would feel like to experience that. And just by listening and imagining what it would be like ourselves to go through that, then this way we express empathy. And we can say, oh yeah, I see how that could be so painful. We see how that could be so difficult. And in fact, it's quite important that we cultivate this way of giving protection from fear, because if we don't listen to others and express this empathy, then we remain imprisoned in a very narrow space of our own experiences and just of our own mind, and it's impossible to grow. Actually, through empathy, it's this powerful way to see the world through new eyes. And also, giving freedom from fear can mean being with those who have no companions. And maybe that was the most radical part of the Yeshe Tsogyal story, where she is the companion of this leper who is so lonely. And isn't this the truth, that there's so much loneliness, especially at this time of year? And to remember this, to reach out to our loved ones and say hello, and to even befriend strangers and to be there for each other in this way is an expression of giving freedom from fear. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's always talk, especially in traditional literature, about the fear of death, that every person fears death. But I think for our culture, we fear loneliness the most. And so giving companionship can be an extraordinary way of expressing generosity and an accessible way for us. Finally, the third of the three, giving material generosity. The second was giving freedom from fear. And the third is giving the Dharma, or giving the means to liberation. I like to think of this as giving education, because there is nothing more powerful or more liberating than education, except love itself. If we can give others education, support their education, give them access to education, then this is also an exceptional way to express generosity. And the education, of course, is quite transformative. And even though when this one is taught, it's usually taught about giving Buddhist education. How do you work with your mind? How do you work with emotions? What is the purpose of life? What is your true identity? It's really about giving the ultimate education. Even though it is about the ultimate education, from what I've seen, that ultimate education relies on hundreds of thousands of little bits of learning of practical education. That when we give knowledge and share knowledge, we are opening the floodgates to further and further learning and further enlightenment and awakening for others. How do we do this? We can share books, we can dialogue, we can sponsor other people to do their spiritual training and retreats. This is an exceptional generosity, because it is the generosity that frees the mind. In this life story of Yeshe Tsogyal, she is often giving these profound Dharma teachings. She gives them from the end of her retreat to the end of her life. And even, as is customary in some Buddhist stories, after she dies, she even gives a teaching. And but I think in this evening's story, what an interesting teaching that she gave when she told Sakyadema that, oh, my mind is the source of inexhaustible desires. She gave a teaching about the mind itself as the practice of generosity. This is super radical. It's a short part of her life story, but it's an extraordinary radical idea. In Tibetan Buddhism, sometimes they talk about the mind like this, that it's Yishin Norbu, the wish-fulfilling jewel, that our mind gives whatever is needed. And it's almost like New Age teachings, because we hear, oh yeah, whatever your life is, it's manifested from the mind, from your thoughts, from your subconscious beliefs. And that's not too different than the Tibetan Buddhist idea. But here, she's pointing to something even deeper than this, that the mind actually gives us Buddha nature, that within us, we have an already complete, already whole, already wise and pure Buddha nature. And this Buddha nature is the mind's generosity to us and to our world. And our practice in the path of generosity is not just about giving to others and being their companion or feeding animals and saving lives and all of these acts of profound altruism. But our practice of generosity also rests on giving ourselves over to our Buddha mind, the source of the most radical generosity there is, which is to give the sense of innate goodness and innate wholeness. Yeshe Tsogyal says, my mind is already spontaneously the source of every desire, the inexhaustible well. Certainly we don't always experience that, and Buddhism has a lot to say about how this comes about. We get disassociated from our Buddha mind. We get caught up in these terrible mental afflictions, and we think that's who we are. We get worn down, distracted. We are too busy to even look. But ultimately, our spiritual sustenance, our spiritual practice, our spiritual path is about finding this Buddha mind, reconnecting with it, letting go into it, making some space in our lives, the generosity that is the source of all other generosity, making that space in our lives to come to know the wish fulfilling jewel of the mind. In this way, I have given you a brief overview of the 3 types of generosity, as well as the examples from the Yeshe Tsogyal life story. But one question that I brought up remains unanswered. How do we know when we've practiced too much generosity? Is there such thing? And actually, in the texts that talk about the bodhisattvas, who are the highly realized beings who have perfected generosity, there are explicit teachings about this question. In fact, one of the teachings of exceptional generosity is said to be giving our own life, giving our own limbs. And this is always given with a warning that one can't really do this unless one is completely enlightened as a Buddha. There's a funny story of Tome Sambuta, who was a Tibetan Buddhist master, that he was so generous that he would exchange his coat with a beggar and give the beggar the new coat, and he would take on this coat of the beggar that was full of fleas, and he would wear it so that the fleas could eat his body and drink his blood. I guess that's what fleas do. And then that they would be satisfied by this, and he would be expressing this generosity to them. And one day someone asked Tome Sambuta, whoa, if we were to practice like this, wouldn't we lose our lives if we were to practice such extreme generosity? And Tome Sambuta said, yes, absolutely. No one should practice like this unless you've realized emptiness and basically become a Buddha yourself. And so this is really important. Why are those stories there? They're so radical. Like the story of being the companion to the leper, or other stories like Tome Sambuta's. Well, they are provocative stories to put us in this question: when is giving too much giving? And we do need to ask this. One of the ways that it's addressed is to say, well, you're not a fully realized Buddha, so don't worry. You should just give in such a way that still cares for your body, still cares for your life. But my favorite way of explaining that is from the Bodhisattva teachings that say we always have to practice generosity for ourselves and others. And this is the prayer that we see over and over and over again in Tibetan Buddhism. At the end of every practice, we say, I practice enlightenment for myself and others. I want to practice the path of enlightenment, that is, for myself and others. If we just practice for ourselves, that's not Buddhism. If we just practice for others, that's not Buddhism either. But for us on the path, we practice for both self and other. And in that, it's something so much more radical and challenging. How can we practice that kind of generosity that's as generous to ourselves as well as others? Because we are interdependent and both matter equally. So I see time is running out. I want to make 5 minutes or so for questions if you'd like, and then we'll end with some meditation practice. So you can type your question in the chat box, and I will see it pop up there, I believe. So Sandy asks, how can we be authentically generous without playing the role of the hero and tied to ego? Yes, this is a really important question that we have to look at. This is taught in the teachings of the five Buddha families, that one of the false generosities is when we're not really giving, but we're actually performing an act of giving in order to get something, in order to control someone, or in order to gratify our own arrogance and think, oh, I'm the hero, I'm this, I'm that. And I think that the way that Tibetan Buddhism is trying to work against this is by telling these stories that are really hyperbolic, like Yeshe Tsogyal's, where she's like with a leper. At one point, someone asks for her kneecaps and she gives them. It puts us as ordinary practitioners as being so far from that level of generosity that we can never really develop too much arrogance, because we're only giving a teacup and Yeshe Tsogyal's giving the whole ocean. And so I think that's one way to that Tibetan Buddhist teachings try to protect us from that state, and why the stories are so radical as they are. We're not giving our coat to beggars and then letting lice eat us. So we're always practicing in a much more humble and modest way, whatever we give. But definitely, if we give in such a way that it's to get or to control or to bolster our ego, then it's not considered a practice of generosity and it doesn't accumulate merit. So it's actually really quite important to freely give. Oh, okay, great. What a great question. I wish I could say more about it, but I see we're running out of time. Okay, no more questions came in that I see. Tashi delay. Okay, good. All right, then let's finish with a short meditation. This is, oh, sorry, one did come in at the last moment. Can you speak about generosity related to humility? I'm not sure your question, what it is. So can you type a little more details for me there so I can understand what you're asking? Or maybe it's already answered it from the previous. It looks like, okay, I think maybe it was already answered. All right, thank you so much. Let's finish then by doing a meditation. And why don't we all sit up in your chair? If you're in a chair, you can have your feet flat. Or if you're on a meditation cushion, have the cushion underneath your hips. And then we'll soften the belly, widen the shoulders. Eyes are open, but they gaze down so that we're looking at the same angle as your nose. And then let that gaze rest in one place. And let's start by taking a few breaths. Exhale your breath completely so that you're emptying the exhale out more than usual. And in this way, we're synchronizing our body and mind. Again, exhaling your breath, empty out the breath more than usual. And one more time, exhaling. Good, and then let's let the breath return to its own pace. There's no changing the breath at all now. And we'll sit here for just a few minutes, quietly, counting the exhales of the breath. Every time you exhale, count 1. The next time you exhale, count that as 2. The next exhale, count as 3. So we're counting each exhale. Count up to 21 and then back down to 0. If you lose count, no problem, just start again. This is a technique of calm abiding meditation. Shine, it's called, abiding in peace. Counting the exhales of the breath. And we'll sit quietly like this for just a few minutes. Good, and let's double that exhale again. You can let go of the count. Empty out your breath completely. And we'll let go of the practice. And you can lift your gaze, and I am so delighted to have just barely made it under our time requirement of the 45 minutes. So I won't take any more questions tonight, but if you did miss any questions, then hopefully you can join us sometime in daily Dharma gathering. And when I'm there, I answer questions as well. So
Thank you very much, Rinpoche. I did want to take just a moment to thank everyone for joining us, and to I have copied the link where you will be able to find the recordings of the Building a Mindful New Year programs in the chat window. Also, it's probably easier if you just go find the email that had the link to this session. It also has the link to where those recordings will be posted either sometime in the next day. It's one I don't have access to change, so Susan Piver's assistant will be doing that. So also tomorrow, our second day of the 6 paramitas will be on discipline, and Susan Piver will be teaching. So please join us at 7 o'clock Eastern time tomorrow. So, and also, if you do have friends, I did want to mention that we did max out Zoom tonight. So I expect there were people who were not able to get on the live broadcast. So if you hear of anyone that was disappointed, be sure to remind them that they can visit the recording at those links. So again, thank you, teacher. And I will go ahead and turn things over for you to close the session for us.
may all beings be free from suffering and the cause of suffering. May all beings experience joy and its true cause. May the fruit of this teaching and all of our activity be to accomplish the highest benefit for all beings and all things everywhere. May all beings and all things everywhere experience the joy, clarity, dignity, and fearlessness of peace. May all beings and all things everywhere have peace.
Thank you.